Hello friends! For the past year and a half, I've been part of a group researching and creating a play, which is an intersectional look at women's suffrage in Kentucky. It's been a very, very cool process, and I have learned so much, and I want to be able to share with you guys some of the stories I've learned. We will be talking about Kentucky, so there will be some racism and some drama. But there's a lot more to the story than just a bunch of white ladies. So much change happened on the state and local level, and if we only look at the national movement, we miss out on some stories of incredibly amazing women. And also some Louisville women were involved in the national movement, like Nanny Helen Burroughs. You may have seen her picture floating around Instagram with accounts that are uplifting black suffragists. She was originally from Washington, D.C., but she lived in Louisville for a time, and she made connections here which she took with her, and she kept up as she went on to found a school in Washington, D.C., when she wasn't just traveling around the country as an awesome orator, occasionally talking about women's suffrage. She was a really, really cool lady, and she lived in my city. And I will be talking about her a bit more. I also want to clarify before I dive in my use of the gays in the title of this video. I use that ironically as a bisexual person who uses she and they pronouns and spends some of my free time trying to get conversion therapy banned in the state of Kentucky. So, context. And also there's a question mark because in a lot of cases, even when two women clearly had a lifelong devoted relationship, there isn't evidence unless you're Ann Lister and you just left like hundreds of pages of coded stuff. Thanks, Ann Lister. But anyway, a lot of times it's impossible to know whether two women were queer or whether they were just really good friends, even when there's like some really suspicious stuff. The ideas of queerness 100 years ago were very distinct from the ideas we have today, so even if two women were queer, that might not be how they would have described themselves. This video is to honor the 100-year anniversary of the 19th Amendment being ratified. Yay! It's been 100 years. It's only been 100 years. The amendment passed on August 19th and was officially signed and made official on August 26th. To be fair, in the case of women of color, there was still a lot of voter suppression and stuff happening. It's still happening. And I've seen some memes going around saying things like, black women didn't really get the right to vote until 1965. And while I think memes like that are well-intentioned, I think that they can also give the impression that those problems have been solved. Spoiler alert, they haven't been. There's still a lot of disenfranchisement and voter suppression, and we need to be talking about it more and not giving any indication that all those problems have been solved, because they haven't. And also, I feel like it can invalidate the stories of the women of color who were voting at that time. I have a book. This is 2 centuries of Black Louisville, a photographic history. This is my city. Where's the photo I'm looking for? This is poll workers from the National Association of Colored Women in 1920. These were awesome ladies, and they existed. And saying black women didn't vote until 1965, while it draws attention to important issues, I also want to uplift these ladies too. Before the 19th Amendment, there had also been some limited suffrage. Certain states did allow women to vote, kind of like how there was gay marriage in certain states before it passed nationally. A lot of times women were also allowed to vote in school board elections. Oh, and talking about black women voting, trust me, there were a lot of people that were kind of mad about how many black women voted in the Lexington, Kentucky school board elections of 1894. They were very salty. But that is the part of the story where women were allowed to vote. I'm gonna start backtracking to around the time that a lot of American women started asking for the right to vote, which was around the mid-1800s. Other fun intersectional fact is that even though Native Americans weren't guaranteed the right to vote in every state until 1962, the Iroquois Nation, which held men and women as very equal, actually had a pretty great influence over suffragists like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was one of the leaders at the Seneca Falls Convention in, I'm bad with dates, 1848, where a bunch of white women got together and were basically like, we're gonna write a parody of the Declaration of Independence, only it's gonna be like, please, let us vote. Please. And not long after that, in 1851, Sojourner Truth gave her famous Ain't I a Woman speech to a women's suffrage convention in Akron, Ohio. And that is a powerful speech. It's only like 2 pages long. 10 out of 10 would recommend looking up the Ain't I a Woman speech. Then there was that whole Civil War thing. And in 1868, the 15th Amendment passed, which, at least theoretically, gave Black Americans the right to vote. At that point, some Black women and definitely some white ladies were like really, really mad and said some really tasteless things about like, you're letting these people vote, but not us. Yeah, there was some divisiveness. But it also really was a blow to women's suffrage and a lot of people who had been hoping that when Black Americans gained the right to vote, women would also gain the right to vote. In my city, there wasn't a lot of traction on any issues of women's suffrage until the 1880s and 1890s. In 1888, the Kentucky Equal Rights Association was founded. This organization's goal was to promote women's suffrage, but it also had some other goals first, like school suffrage, and also, letting married women have control over their own property. One Kentucky suffragist, Eliza Calvert Hall, wrote this awesome collection of short stories called Aunt Jane of Kentucky, and one of them is called Sally Ann's Experience, where Sally Ann just goes off on everyone in church about how the husbands are not giving women the access to their property and are completely screwing them over as a result of that. And she is on fire. She is calling people out. She is preaching. That is also free on the internet. 10 out of 10 would also recommend reading Sally Ann's Experience. At the end of that short story, the narrator alludes to a little parcel of women who have been going down to Frankfort, Kentucky's capital, in order to petition for more rights. In real life, that epic trio was Laura Clay, Eugenia Farmer, and Josephine Henry. They kept going to Frankfort and being like, please give us our rights for about 10 years. But then there was a bit of a rift. Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote a book called The Woman's Bible, which kind of trashed on Christianity and was like, this is a very patriarchal religion and it's not doing any good for us. Some women, like Josephine Henry, were like, yeah, Christianity is not really good for feminism. And then other people, like Laura Clay, were like, don't take my Bible away from me. There are plenty of passages that I can cite that are well and good and supportive of women, so yeah. And that was the end of them working together. After 10 years of progress, they kind of split. And Laura Clay stayed in power. Meanwhile, in Louisville, the abolitionist Susan Look Avery was founding the Louisville Equal Rights Association. She and her husband have been active in the Civil War. He sold farm implements and got really, really rich. She was much less racist than Laura Clay. We'll get back to Laura Clay being racist, I promise. Susan Look Avery, her heart was in the right place, I think. I've read her pamphlet, Justice to the Negro, and even though she was like, hey, let's give these people, including Black women, rights and space in the movement, the language that she uses is very, very paternalistic and very, very problematic when viewed by today's standards. So it's complex, even in cases where the white women weren't just blatantly racist and were actually trying to make progress, they weren't always doing it in ways that we would call good by today's standards. But for her time, Susan Look Avery was pretty radical and pretty progressive. At 68 years old, after the death of her husband in 1885, she launched herself even further into activism. She helped to found the Louisville Equal Rights Association. In 1889, Susan was named the honorary vice president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. So she's another person who was from Louisville that was also recognized on a national level. At the same time these white women were working to get women's suffrage passed, there were a lot of Black women that were also working for a lot of the same causes. And I think there's some really interesting reasons why they aren't recognized more often, more than just like blatant racism and erasure of Black women in history, which is definitely a thing. But also, something I've noticed is that a lot of the times these women weren't working in organizations that explicitly branded themselves as suffrage organizations. But also, Black women didn't need to form a suffrage-specific organization to promote the vote, which is pretty kind of cool that they didn't have to be like, we're gonna go over to our women's suffrage corner. No, it's like every club that I read about was like, oh no, women's suffrage is a good idea. Sweet. Some of these women that I have studied include Mary Virginia Cook Parrish, who was awesome. She was a professor in like the early 1900s at State University, which later became Simmons College. Another incredible lady was Georgia Nugent. She was one of 4 sisters, 3 of whom became teachers, and all 4 of whom became leaders in their community. Mary Virginia Parrish and Nanny Burroughs were actually pretty close friends. Mary Virginia Parrish later served on the board of the school that Nanny founded in Washington, D.C. Mary Virginia Cook Parrish and Georgia Nugent were both really, really active in the National Association of Colored Women. In 1910, that National Association held their national conference in Louisville. Maggie Washington, the wife of Booker T. Washington, was the keynote speaker. Several of the women that we had been studying cropped up in the notes about who was running things. Alice Nugent, George's sister, she ran the music. She played piano. She was pretty cool. There were also speeches planned, including one the first day called The Practical View of Women's Suffrage. Just because it's not a suffrage organization doesn't mean they aren't talking about suffrage, basically. They also talked about education, the need for more playgrounds, and what it's like for women to be entering professional circles. It was a pretty cool conference by the looks of it. The Louisville mayor was supposed to come and speak, but instead he issued a written statement, which is once again like people trying to be not racist, and it's just you read it today and it's super cringy. Warning. This could be triggering because it's just that really bad. The mayor sent this statement calling enslaved people grown children, and he said, during the short intervening years since slavery ended, there has been a wonderful advancement, and thousands of these child minds in adult bodies have grown and developed until now we have such organization as the National Association of the Colored Women, which is earnestly working for the uplift of its race. If that's how he talks when he's trying to be not racist, The White Ladies also had a national conference in Louisville 1 year later in 1911. The main speaker at their conference was the British suffragette, at that point on the run from the law, Emmeline Pankhurst. I really like Emmeline Pankhurst. You can see her beautifully portrayed by Tatiana Maslany in a very wonderful drunk history video about suffragists learning jujitsu, which is a thing that happened in history. And she was also played by Meryl Streep, which is pretty cool. When you actually hear or read the literal words of Emmeline Pankhurst, she becomes somehow even cooler than Tatiana Maslany and Meryl Streep could make her. And I feel like a blasphemer when I say that, but it's the truth. The Courier-Journal, Louisville's paper, basically transcribed a lot of the speeches and interviews from this convention. They didn't do that with the Black Women's Convention, which makes me very sad. But it's still cool to have the White Ladies Convention because we have gems like this from Emmeline Pankhurst. Excuse me while I attempt to do a British accent. We only threw a few stones, just enough to let the men know that we were in earnest. Probably 50 stones were thrown during the 3 or 4 years of the agitation. Not a stone went through a window into a meeting hall without the message, "Give women the vote," being attached to it. These methods obtained for us what all our patients had failed to obtain. So, people talking about, like, protesters in modern day using destruction of property as a way to get a message across, they would have been terrified of this, like, tiny little British lady. Wow. Yeah, she talks about how she got the idea by looking at, men's history and how they got their rights, and she was like, oh, they were violent. We should be violent too. Jane Addams, the founder of Hull House, was also there. And she actually gave a really, really lovely speech about Susan Look Avery, who was not able to be there because she was out of town and very old and very sick by this point. Jane Addams said, "There is none more charming than Miss Susan Look Avery, now more than 90 years old, but still youthful in the most beautiful meaning of the word. When I once asked her how she managed in her green old age, she promptly replied, 'I am espousing always the unpopular cause. When you lead a popular cause, people treat you with so much veneration and such consideration you just sit back and do nothing but grow old.' When I was in Louisville, I was an abolitionist, and of course, led an unpopular cause. And then I took up women's suffrage. I've never had time to grow old peacefully since, child, there's nothing like unpopularity for keeping you young, and so I'm passing that advice on to you." Susan Look Avery is the epitome of awesome lady for her time, still really problematic by today's standards. And you can't forget today's standards, but you also can't forget the historical context. So it ends up just being a lot of Around 1910 and 1911, there was a lot of momentum for women's suffrage. But before I return to the momentum for women's suffrage, I would like to take a beautiful moment to tell you about 2 of my favorite suffragists that I've discovered while researching this. Dr. Anna Lawrence and Dr. Julia Ingram of Louisville, Kentucky. They were founding members of the Louisville Equal Rights Association. They were the first women doctors in Louisville, Kentucky, and they also lived together their entire lives. A Courier Journal article from the 1890s described them and their work. They ran a doctor's office together, and one of them saw patients in the morning and one of them saw patients in the afternoon. Anna was described as an Eastern woman. She was from Massachusetts, but Julia Ingram was from Clark County in Indiana, just across the river from Louisville. The newspaper described her as tall and slender, with a countenance so pleasing that it at once invites friendship and mutual confidence. Her bluish-gray eyes and youthful face are in striking contrast to her curling locks of snowy whiteness. Now let me read you the description of their office. The office of Doctors Ingram and Lawrence is very much like that of the other physicians. There is a gas stove on the east side, while opposite is a safety bicycle, which Dr. Lawrence uses in making her house calls. On the walls, there are a few pictures, such as a man might fancy. On the center table is placed a number of articles and pamphlets, a small clock, matchbox, paperweight, and prescription blanks being scattered about the table. Both women are unmarried and give their entire attention to their professional duties. Oh yeah, and if that sounds a little gay at times, women of this era, many of them closeted, did occasionally live with other women in what were known as Boston marriages. For example, in the National Women's Movement, Dr. Shaw, who was the president of the National American Woman Suffrage Association for quite a time, lived most of her life with her companion, Lucy Anthony, who was, I believe, the niece of Susan B. Anthony. So suffragists, they definitely lived together and perished for their entire life, just casually, as friends. And oftentimes, some of these queer, some of these not, were known as Boston marriages. Guess what city Julia and Anna met in? Boston! I was literally sitting as we were reading through their biography, which was written as one, because their lives were so intertwined. I'm just thinking, this sounds like a Boston marriage. This sounds like a Boston marriage. And then it was like, they met in Boston. I was like, why can't I have proof? Why? Anyway, they lived their whole lives together. They enjoyed gardening. They lived 3 blocks from where I've spent about half a decade of my life working. Anna is buried in Julia's family plot, catty corner. I know, because I went and visited their graves and laid flowers on them. And also there are literally no plaques or monuments or even photos of these two women who were the first female doctors in Louisville. There's just nothing. And that makes me really genuinely sad. Whether or not these women were secretly queer icons, they were the first female physicians in Louisville, and the fact that there isn't even photographs that we have of them, and I've tried really hard to find them. That's why I really wanted to include them in this video, because I think they really deserve more recognition. So, back to the overall story of suffrage. In 1910 and 1911, there was a lot of momentum, and then there was this whole thing called, World War I, although at the time it was called the Great War or whatever, but, revisionism. It's lovely when you have two wars that are so bad you have to call them 1 and 2. Oh my gosh. Not that I feel like I'm living through a similar time in history right now where crazy stuff just keeps happening. The efforts of women in the war actually really helped to contribute to the popularity of women's suffrage. People saw women working as nurses or holding down the front at home and were like, oh, maybe we should let these people vote. The suffragists often supported peace efforts, and I actually found another really cool article about the Louisville suffragists planning a play, which was a fundraiser for Victory Gardens, helping to get food in order to, feed the troops. And I was really, really excited about this play that the suffragists put on, because we were doing a play. And then I started reading the reviews, and it's oh, and the minstrel song, and I was like, they had blackface. Of course they had blackface. Oh, these white ladies, damn it! Also, this was blackface, I might note, in the same century that I was born. Yeah, blackface was way too popular, way too recently, and people are like, oh, it was in the past, and it's this is 1918. That really was not that long ago. But anyway, oh my gosh, it's fall of 1918, the war's about to end in November probably, and women's suffrage is about to be voted on late September, early October kind. And everyone really thought that women's suffrage was going to pass. It was really, really close, and women were talking it up in newspapers. And then the vote comes in 1918, and they lose by like 2 votes. And then literally like the next week, at least in Louisville, the city gets shut down by a giant pandemic. And I can unfortunately, at this point, pretty vividly imagine what kind of blow that must have meant. First, women's suffrage fails when everyone thought that it was going to pass, and then there's this giant pandemic. But the war ended in November, so I guess that's a plus. So most women were pretty upset when the amendment didn't pass. But not all women in Kentucky. I said I was gonna come back to the racist saga of Laura Clay. Yeah, this isn't like with Susan Look Avery where I was like, she was trying, but it was probably not. No, Laura Clay. Well, you'll see. So I'm gonna tell you a little bit about the states' rights movement within women's suffrage. And if you think states' rights is code for, hey, we're kind of racist, you're actually wrong. It's code for, we're really, really racist. So, Laura Clay and her friend Miss Kate Gordon from New Orleans helped to form this lovely organization, the Conference of Southern Women Suffragists. Let me just read you their statement of purpose. The body of representative women from the different states of the South who convened in the city on Wednesday and Thursday declared their object very definitively. I'm just gonna skip down to the 3rd paragraph where the really racist stuff happens rather than the tacitly racist stuff before it. Okay, we ask for the ballot as a solution of the race problem. There are over 600,000 more white women in the southern states than all the Negro men and women combined. If the women of the South were enfranchised, it would ensure a permanent and enormous preponderance of the white race in politics and would preclude the necessity for any doubtful expedients to minimize the Negro vote. This was called the numbers argument, and it was unfortunately popular with white suffragists. A lot of Southern suffragists, or probably racist suffragists in the North, didn't like the idea of the national amendment passing because it was less likely than Southern states' amendments to disenfranchise black women. Oh yeah, they attempted to do this through blatant disenfranchisement and also through educational requirements. They tried that in Kentucky, but then it was like, plot twist, black women can read. So yeah, that didn't end up working too well in Kentucky. Darn it. And there was some scheming from Madeline Breckinridge, who was also involved in the movement, and she was like, sure, racist people, let's have this education requirement, and I'll discourage black women from voting. And then she was like also part of the NAACP and like just like turned around and was like, hey, black women, come vote. Screw y'all. Laura Clay really wanted her friend Madeline Breckinridge to, if not like agree with her about the whole states' rights thing, to at least understand her position. She wrote this like deeply pleading letter, and to be fair, she didn't use the numbers argument in that case. She talked about like national corruption and wanting to do it the right way and making sure that the women in all the states had a voice. So it seems like there were actually some arguments that might not have been from a place of racism, although I'll be honest, I'm kind of skeptical. After the suffrage amendment passed in 1919, Laura Clay cut all ties with the Kentucky Women's Rights Association and set up her own like concerned citizens board trying to get a state amendment passed even after the national amendment had passed. Like, we talk about like the women were exclusionary, but we don't talk about like the systematic ways in which Southern women tried to screw over black women. And if you're in Kentucky, unfortunately, it's a part of our history of state suffrage. But also part of our history are women like Georgia Nugent, Alice Nugent, Mamie Stewart, Mary Virginia Cook Parrish, and all of these incredible black women who were leaders in their community fighting for the right for all women to be able to vote. Of all of my primary source documents that I've been able to find as part of this whole project, one of my favorites, probably my favorite, is this incredible article from 1920. 6 black women, including Mary Virginia Parrish, wrote it at the end of July, when they knew that there was enough momentum and that the 19th Amendment was going to be ratified. It was titled Another Platform. They said, since it is evident that the women of the nation are soon to be invested with the right of full franchise. We wish to go on record as asking the instructors of the country, especially those in colored schools, to teach our children the lives of the great men and women of our race who have thus far shaped and are shaping our destinies. They go on to talk about a ton of issues, about the importance of educating everyone on civics, about the problematic portrayal of Black people in the media, which intentionally creates anger against them. I'm looking at you, 2020, and literally, like, the rest of history. They even talked about the need for an anti-lynching law, which we are still talking about. This article just fills me with so much hope and gratitude for the work that these women did, but also reminds me that there is so much work left to be done. These ladies literally left us a checklist, and we are not done filling it out. Women were fighting for suffrage all over, in every state. In the minutes of the Kentucky Equal Rights Association, I just see the names of towns like Hodgenville and Beattyville, towns where I've worked in very remote places in Kentucky at times. And even in these really small towns, people were fighting for women's suffrage. And it wasn't just a bunch of white ladies. And I really think that that's an important story to tell. I really want to take a moment to be grateful for those women and all of the incredible work that they did. But I also want to follow their example, because there is a whole lot more work to do. So let's get out and do it. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.